What's the latest in the Israel-Hamas war? The summit meeting of the negotiating countries concluded in Qatar on Friday. What was decided? What are the main disagreements? And where do things stand in the hostage negotiations and the ceasefire talks? I am Alon Burstein. Let's dive in. On day 316 to the war, the main news revolves around the hostage negotiations. The summit meeting of the hostage and truce negotiations concluded yesterday in Qatar. The meeting was reportedly positive, and mild optimism is being echoed by different parties since that summit meeting. However, despite this, Israel's Prime Minister's office put out a statement yesterday stating that there is hope that the pressure on Hamas will bring the group to accept the previous terms and proposals, i.e. that there is mild optimism, but still that Israel is hoping that there will be pressure on Hamas and that they will accept the previous proposals and terms that Israel has set. And Hamas in turn put out a statement today saying that despite the optimistic statements that are being issued by the different negotiators, none of the main issues were actually debated in the negotiations. I remind everyone that Hamas said it is not going to participate in this round of negotiations. This is the first round that is occurring since the assassination of Hamas's leader of the external leadership, Ismail Haniyeh. However, there have been lots of reports that Hamas has been talking to the negotiators behind the scenes and is very up to date about what was discussed in that meeting. So what do we know about the summit meeting and what is going to happen from now? As a reminder, the framework that is being discussed is the deal that the US President Biden made public back in May, which at the time was approved by Israel as well. Hamas did not accept the deal back then. However, by the time it did show more flexibility at the beginning of July and said that it is willing to accept a certain version of that deal, new terms have been raised by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, leading to an effective stalemate in the last month and a half. During the summit meeting that occurred now, the negotiators made a strategic decision to focus the initial phase of the talks on the more technical facets of the deal, hoping to pick up from the initial agreements in May and July and to establish working groups in order to actually work on the other facets of the deal and not focus on the additional terms and hardships that have come up in the last several months, hoping to somehow jumpstart the deal and then bring the parties together to finalize the more difficult sticking points. To this end, 4 working groups have been established by the negotiating countries, with some of the negotiating teams scheduled to meet already in the coming week. The different negotiating task forces that have been established are: one is a team that is tasked with negotiating the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and how this is going to be managed during the phases of the truce and possible ceasefire. That team is scheduled to meet at the beginning of the coming week in Cairo. A second team was tasked with negotiating the hostage and prisoner exchange, that is, how many Palestinian prisoners and which ones are going to be exchanged for how many Israeli hostages, and if they are live hostages or dead hostages. That team is also scheduled to meet at the beginning of the coming week in Cairo. The other two teams that were established are a bit more problematic. One was a team that was tasked with negotiating the Rafah crossing. These negotiations are supposed to take place involving Egypt, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority. However, it's important to note that as of now, no meetings have been scheduled for this team, since neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority were present in the summit meeting, so it was decided that this task force will be established. However, the parties that were supposed to negotiate weren't actually present. It's also important to note that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have vast disagreements on how the Rafah crossing should be run, and in addition to that, that Israel has vetoed either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority taking responsibility for the Gazan side of the Rafah crossing. So there is a team that's supposed to meet, that's supposed to be comprised of Egypt, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority to discuss the Rafah crossing. Remains to be seen what that team is actually going to be able to accomplish. The fourth team that was established was a team that's designated to negotiate the IDF presence along the Philadelphia line. The Philadelphia line is the border between Gaza and Egypt. Right now, it is controlled by the IDF on the Gazan side. Egypt has refused to accept IDF presence there, as has Hamas. The negotiations are supposed to be direct between Israel and Egypt. However, also those have not been scheduled, and remains to be seen what can be accomplished there, since Hamas actually has to be the one that will eventually agree, possibly, to the terms of this deal. According to what was been published, all teams are supposed to meet in Cairo for another summit towards the end of the coming week or the beginning of the following week, reportedly in order to conclude the talks once they have worked out all of those different points and actually initiate the deal. Now, with that, it's important to note that while statements coming out from the summit about the operational work of the teams makes it seem like all these facets are about to be resolved and a deal is about to commence, there are still many substantial issues that remain. A major one regards the exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners. The main disagreements revolve around the fact that Hamas demands that it will choose which Palestinian prisoners will be released, while Israel is demanding veto power over which Palestinian prisoners will be released, as well as the right to expel prisoners from the region. In addition, Israel is also demanding to receive a list of live hostages that will be released in the first phase of the deal, that is defined as the quote-unquote humanitarian phase of the deal that revolves around the releasing of female captives as well as elderly and people who were injured. Hamas has stated that this list is only going to be provided once the deal is agreed upon and not before. According to some reports, in the summit meeting, Israel agreed to relinquish its veto power in exchange for receiving the list of live hostages during the first phase of the deal. However, those reports are very unsubstantiated. That is a major sticking point of disagreement between the sides. Remains to be seen how that will be worked out by that negotiating team that's supposed to meet in Cairo. In addition to that, a second major issue, as I stated before, relates to the Rafah crossing. The negotiating team is comprised of Egypt, Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. However, neither the PA nor Hamas were part of the decision to establish this team. At the same time, Israel has also said it's not going to accept Palestinian Authority or Hamas in the Rafah crossing, so obviously Israel has to be involved somehow in these negotiations. Whatever they resolve, Egypt, Hamas, and Palestinian Authority, Israel's going to say does not necessarily bind it. So, remains to be seen how that can be worked out. In addition to this, many have pointed out that despite the advances in establishing these teams and actually setting a deadline for when they're supposed to conclude their negotiations, some of the main disagreements between the sides are not actually tackled by any of the teams. Like I said, this was a strategic decision of the organizers of the summit to try to postpone the harder issues until later, till it seems like a deal can be worked out. However, these are very, very big points, and they have been enough in order to actually circumvent the advancements that were made before. Among others, the IDF presence along the Netzarim corridor is one of the big ones. The Netzarim corridor is the corridor that the IDF maintains from the east to west parts of the Gaza Strip, effectively cutting the strip from the northern parts of the Gaza Strip to the southern parts. Hamas is demanding complete freedom of movement of Palestinians within the Gaza Strip during the truce. This would mean that the IDF would completely withdraw from the Netzarim crossing. This was also, in fact, part of the initial deal back in May. Since then, however, Israel has demanded that armed Palestinians not be permitted to return to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, meaning that de facto either an agreed-upon monitoring mechanism will have to be established, or the IDF checkpoints that are currently there will remain in effect. According to reports, the United States in the last week has stated that it is going to pressure Israel on this matter. However, it's important to note, no team has been tasked to deal with this facet of the Netzarim corridor, so even if all those teams do somehow work out all of the issues, this is a very big issue that has been a red line, defined as a red line, by both Hamas and Israel, so it remains to be seen how that can be worked out. In addition, another major issue that has seemingly been sidelined by the negotiators, again I'll say probably strategically, however it is very, very certain to come up again, is the issue of the transition between the phases of the deal, i.e. after the first 6-week truce, into the second phase of the deal, which is supposed to lead into a long-term ceasefire. Israel has consistently demanded that fighting can resume after the first phase of the deal, i.e. after that first 6-week humanitarian exchange, while Hamas has consistently demanded that the truce be extended after the first phase until the second phase commences. Like I said, the second phase leads to a long-term ceasefire between the sides, which means that Hamas is demanding that from the first phase of the deal, already the fighting stops as a truce for 6 weeks, and this automatically is extended into the long-term ceasefire. Israel has been consistently saying no. It demands that fighting can resume after 6 weeks. According to reports, when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was in the United States, he also asked President Biden for written assurance that Israel will be able to resume the fighting after 6 weeks. There were no reports if he actually received that. However, this also has not been mentioned in the negotiations or in anything that was said about the summit, so it remains to be seen when this will come up. This has been enough to actually derail previous negotiations, so how is this going to be tackled? Now, because there has been some confusion about this in the past, I'm also going to note that the breakthrough that was reported at the beginning of July suggested that Hamas had relinquished that demand that there be an automatic extension of the truce. However, as I stated in my summary already on July 7th, Hamas's new terms still left the extension of the truce beyond the first phase as one of its demands. They just changed the order of events. However, their demand still remains in effect, so it remains to be seen how the negotiators are going to try to tackle this. With this, I will say, however, that the summit can be defined as somewhat of a success, since after all of these stalemates for the last almost month and a half, we are now actually seeing that there is progress in terms of the teams meeting. All I am suggesting is there are still major issues that have not been tackled yet, so it remains to be seen when they're going to be tackled and how this is going to affect the other facets of the negotiations. All this obviously remains to be seen in the coming days. Those are my highlights from the summit meeting in Qatar. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I am Alon Burstein. I am a visiting assistant professor and an Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.